Moshe ben Maimon the Rambam Maimonides, or my favorite, Hanesher Hagadol, the Great Eagle, has had a decisive impact on the history of Jewish philosophy specifically, and Western philosophy more generally. In fact, Thomas Aquinas simply refers to him as Rabbi Moses in his works, and, as the saying goes, from Moses to Moses, none arose like Moses. Heralded as a figure of strict Aristotelian rationalism, and then later praised as a Kabbalistic adept, lauded for his compendium of Jewish law, which was subsequently burned in the streets as heresy. There's a good chance there's even a day school, a high school, or a hospital named after the guy somewhere near you. Maimonides also sat at one of the great crossroads in the history of Jewish mysticism and the occult. Prior to his lifetime, the dominant form of Jewish mysticism were the practices of the Merkavah mystics, who sought to journey to hidden palaces of the divine, to witness the glory of the divine body. And after his lifetime, we see the rise of the theosophical and prophetic Kabbalah with their speculations on the divine emanations, or sefirot, and the theurgy by which to harmonize them. A series of daring new studies has argued that his position at this crossroads is no accident. Rather, he played a pivotal role in the process of just that transition. By philosophically combating previous forms of Jewish mysticism, he might have inadvertently, even ironically, propelled the nascent ideas of the Kabbalah into their own escape velocity from medieval Aristotelian rationalism. But did Maimonides' philosophy really end one form of mysticism only to give birth to another via reaction? And how did Aristotelian nominalism become later associated with just a form of mysticism he might very well have opposed? Let's explore Maimonides at the crossroads of the mystical and the occult. This episode is also very special to me because it's a collaboration with two of my colleagues who I'm even more blessed to call friends. Zevi over at Seekers of Unity will be providing an overview of Maimonides' thought in a series he's doing, especially in this episode in his relationship to mysticism and the Kabbalah more specifically. I'll be tackling Maimonides and his alleged pivotal role in the history of Jewish mysticism, and Philip over at Let's Talk Religion will be covering the connection between Maimonides' son, Avraham, and Sufism. I really can't say how really happy I am that we can be living in a time where I can work together across 3 countries with such fine scholars and people dedicated to making topics in mysticism, religious studies, and philosophy widely and freely accessible. We are living in great times, folks. Make sure to check out their episodes, subscribe to their channels, and support their work if you're able. Of course, I hope you'd also check out my other content on topics of the academic study of esotericism, the occult, magic, alchemy, Kabbalah, all the weird stuff. But now, let's turn to Maimonides at the very crossroads of magic, mysticism, and the occult. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. So to start, I have to admit that I personally have a great deal of sympathy with Maimonides' overall project and his methodology. He wishes to make obscure, esoteric topics clear to those willing to do the work of studying them carefully. It's kind of my bag. In that way, we're kind of kindred spirits, though to be a bit more specific, His major work, the Guide to the Perplexed, the Moreh Nevuchim, is clearly written for one of his students to clarify three increasingly obscure aspects of the Hebrew Bible. The first are terms that apply to God, which if you read them literally, would be incorrect and would lead you to a misunderstanding of the divine nature and, to heretical metaphysics more generally. Thus, much of the first book is going term by term by term, used to describe the divine and interpreting them in such a way that one cannot come away with the conception that God has a body of any kind. Indeed, here we find his famous commitment to the theological via negativa, such that no propositions are univocally true of the divine. Thus, we can only say what God isn't. We can't really say that God is wise. We can only say that God is not foolish. The next two sections deal with topics which in traditional rabbinical Judaism are generally forbidden for public discussion. These are Ma'aseh Bereshit, speculations about the origin and the nature of being, and Ma'aseh Merkava, or speculation on the divine realm, specifically the palaces and the throne of the divine. Maimonides actually does something interesting here. He takes Ma'aseh Bereshit, speculation on the origins and nature of being, to basically mean an exposition on physics as he understands it, specifically the worldview of Islamic Aristotelian physics. Thus, the second book concerns the structure of the universe and the entities that populate the universe more generally, especially the nature of angels and the separate intelligences. More about angels and separate intelligences here in just a little bit. This would also include his theory of prophecy, as our intellects actually reach up and commune with the quasi-divine active intellect. More about the active intellect in a bit as well. It's one of the most perplexing ideas in medieval philosophy. The final book deals with the most esoteric aspect of Judaism, Ma'aseh Merkava. The final section is a detailed analysis of Maimonides' metaphysics, again mostly consonant with Islamic Aristotelian metaphysics, his theodicy or his understanding of evil, and finally the rationale for the nature and practice of the 613 laws to be found in the Torah. Thus, the Moreh Nevuchim, or the Guide to the Perplexed, ends having corrected and undermined potentially heretical understandings of the divine, established the nature of the universe and prophecy, and probe the metaphysical nature of reality, evil, divine law, which produces the harmonious and thriving human being. Whew. As you can see, it's a work of truly titanic scope. And despite it being a bit of a slog to actually get through, it's really a slog to get through, I'm not gonna lie. It's an ingenious work which has rightly earned its place in the history of philosophy and religion. It's worth a read. It's probably worth the slog. Now, recall earlier when I said that I admire the work because of its goal and methodology, that being of clarity? That is, Maimonides is attempting to make previously esoteric and inaccessible concepts more generally comprehensible. Again, I'm about that. Even topics previously forbidden to public discussion, like the origin of the universe or the nature of the divine throne. Well, it's not that simple. I mean, you probably guessed that because this is an episode of Esoterica and not an episode of Exoterica. Maimonides is infamous for dropping not so subtle hints that all through the guide he will, one, not really tell us what he believes. He's just going to dissimulate. And two, that there may be ulterior, hidden motives for his writing the book at all. He's not trying to communicate clearly to us. He's trying to hide something. That's all to say that the Guide to the Perplexed is very likely a work of esoteric writing. That hidden beneath the plain text there are hidden motivations and even positions taken by Maimonides which may very well be not what he held to be true. For instance, I pretty strongly suspect that he held that the world was eternal despite the fact that he said that it was created in the Guide. In fact, there are a ton of parallels here with Ibn Rushd in this regard, though rather than try to excavate these esoteric positions in this episode, probably going to end up doing that in another episode. What I want to do here is explore a claim made about his true motivation for writing the guide in the first place. As I mentioned, the stated aim is to help the student avoid certain kinds of errors and interpretations and provide that student with correct ones and undermine the possibility of committing heresy. Simple enough. But several recent studies, and I'm going to be really clear here and admit that I'm heavily leaning on a work by Menachem Kellner, you can find the link to that book in the description below, have actually argued that Maimonides' work in the guide, but also even his halachic work, his work on Jewish jurisprudence, are actually aimed at combating a wide range of theories and practices that we might clumsily call proto-Kabbalah, despite the fact that he never, or at least very rarely ever names them as such. Have you ever seen somebody post something clearly criticizing somebody or a group of people without really naming them or otherwise specifying the target of their criticism? My argument here, and this argument, is that the guide is doing just this. I think they call it vague booking. Is that what the young people call it? Vague booking? Laying out his positions as a kind of global criticism without ever really directly engaging with the target of his critique. In this case, what some scholars again have called proto-Kabbalah, a term I really dislike, but I'll keep using and talk about why I really don't like that term in a minute. So to grasp Maimonides' project, this line of reasoning goes, we have to understand the so-called proto-Kabbalah he's targeting. So, to the proto-Kabbalah we go. What this term is intended to capture is a wide range of esoteric and occult Jewish theories and practices which primarily emerged in the late classical world and were relatively widespread and popular, it seems, by the time that Maimonides is writing, at least in the Islamic context. In fact, our first glimpse of his disdain for the Judaism of his adult milieu in Egypt is his nostalgic pining for his days of his youth in Spain, where allegedly, at least according to him, Judaism was much more philosophically practiced, as he puts it. I think he's probably just wrong about that. Thus, he hints that the Judaism widely practiced in his current situation is less than philosophical. This usually has a sense of admixed with what we might call superstition or even avodah zarah, something that we might translate as paganism, although that's a terrible translation for it. So what might Maimonides have had in his sights here? I suspect there are four major targets. The first is Hekalot Merkavah Mysticism. Now, as I've covered in another episode, you can check out the card in above and learn more about this form of pre-Kabbalistic Jewish mysticism. This was a form of Jewish shamanism, for lack of a better word, in which rabbinical elites would mystically travel to the divine palaces. They would bypass various angelic guardians using elaborate passcodes in order to eventually gaze upon the divine throne. There's even some texts where you could sit on the divine throne and become an angel. The most famous example of that was the antediluvian patriarch Enoch, being transformed into the angel Metatron. And this brings me to target number 2. One could gaze upon the divine body. Yeah, the divine body. Now, if you've ever tried to slog through the Guide of the Perplexed, Book 1 is a veritable mire of term after term after term, explicated at length so that no one could never come to the conclusion that God has a body in any sense. Now, this Merkava Hekalot mysticism produced another form of literature called Shiur Koma, or the measurement of the vastness, which literally provides mystical names of the various regions of the divine body, and even records the physical dimensions of the divine body in the Persian parasang length. Yeah, like the length between God's eyebrows, or the length of the God's divine arm, or God's fingers, or the divine beard. It's about 40,250 miles, or 64,776 kilometers long, if you're wondering, because of course you were. Now, you can be damn sure that this really ruffled Maimonides' jimmies. In fact, he probably just saw this as straightforward idolatry, and honestly, these are some of the most shocking and unusual texts in the history of Judaism. So if these texts were popular, and there's good reason to believe that they were, we found many manuscripts of them, it's not surprising that the great Ingel would strike down upon them with great vengeance and furious anger, to quote a great prophet of our own time. The third and fourth targets of his attack are likely the widely held beliefs around angels and demons, along with the magical technologies employed to manipulate such beings into one's service. Since the rise of the apocalyptic mode of Judaism in the Persian and Greek periods, angels and demons were popularly thought to proliferate through the universe, performing a wide range of tasks and organized into military-like ranks. I mean, the Talmud says that there are so many demons that if you could see them, that's all that you would see. They could appear in a range of physical forms and had names and personalities. They could audibly speak to you. They could cure you, and they could kill people. They could fly about, and they could generally scare the hell out of people, all the while telling them, "Be not afraid." They were divine messengers, shock troops, and the celestial proletariat who moved the universe about and were, of course, locked into combat with the forces of evil, the demons or the fallen angels. Yeah, they were a bunch of demons too. The fallen angels either rebelled against the divine or left heaven to hook up with earth women, earth girls, or easy. There's a move, depending on the legends you read, and would eventually all be defeated at the end of time in a final apocalyptic battle. Normal stuff. Further, and this is a bit more occulty, they were even able to be controlled by a form of magical literature that has come down to us, in which you could manipulate these angels and demons to do your bidding, from everything to winning at horse races, various magical amulets, segulot or kameot. These could do everything from getting someone to fall in love with you, to healing a disease, or even seeing into the future. Why would anyone want to do that? Magical texts such as the Sefer Harazim, or the Book of Secrets, which I've made an episode about on its own, were composed in the late classical period and seemed to prove very popular. Magic is perennially popular no matter who comes against it. In fact, a surviving manuscript of such a magical book or grimoire was actually found in the Ibn Ezra synagogue in Cairo. Exactly Maimonides' neck of the woods. He probably knew about this book, and he probably didn't like it at all. So what's Maimonides' beef? Well, his argument here is that the way that angels are conceived in the popular imagination, and given his understanding of them, would actually foreclose on any such magical practices. He just thinks people get angels wrong. Practices, again, magical practices, he probably thought were either silly or harmless superstition, which he typically goes to, or, downright idolatry. Again, Maimonides follows a rather strict Aristotelian worldview in which things are composed of form and matter, which is either subject to generation or corruption, or isn't, or beings are composed of pure form, which is not subject to change at all. For him, the angels are pure form, exempted from change, of which there are exactly 10 in number, corresponding to the various superlunar structures of reality, and whose form of causation is final rather than efficient. They can't go causing things in the world like getting people to fall in love with you. That's just not how their causal relationship to reality works. That is to say, they're activated by the divine purely for the end of further activating creation at the metaphysical register. Remember, they're free from all matter and thus all change. Thus, for Maimonides, such beings, angels and demons, can't speak, they don't spatially move, they certainly don't have a personality, and they are moved by the divine and the divine alone. The narratives about them otherwise in the Bible is because the Bible speaks in the language of common people and not the more true technical language of philosophy. The rest of the stories are just straight up nonsense, or worse, idolatry from Maimonides. Thus, his very conception of angels actually just deracinates the very possibility of angel magic from the get-go. Also, malevolent demons just get kicked to the metaphysical curb into the very rubbish bin of ontology itself. He just thinks they're metaphors. They have no non-literary status. In fact, this whole business of sort of getting rid of angels and demons in many ways has been referred to Maimonides' great depopulation of the heavens by scholars, that he sees a heaven full of angels and beings in folklore and just uses metaphysics to eliminate them. Now, with the heavens depopulated, Maimonides also cast a much wider net through his commitment to Aristotelian nominalism as well. Particularly in his sights might be the Neoplatonic philosophy of Judah Halevi and the equally obscure parts of the Sefer Yetzirah, or the Book of Formation. Nominalism is just a philosophical position that holds that universals or categorical terms exist in name only, hence the name nominalism. So when I say that Maimonides is a human being, Maimonides in this view is a substance for whom predicates can be true or false, but human being or humanity doesn't truly exist. There's no humanity separate from the total amount of human beings. Thus, predicates can't really be said to be true or false of that category, because the category has no real ontological status aside from being a name. This position, of course, is to be contrasted with the position of Plato that held that such categories did, in fact, exist as separate eternal forms. Given his position, Maimonides seems to radically dispense with a whole host of critical metaphysical concepts central to this entire proto-Kabbalah business, maybe even Judaism more generally, including concepts like holiness as an ontological concept, the unique status of the people of Israel, ritual purity and impurity, the character of Jewish law, and even the quasi-divine status of the Hebrew language. Yeah, he kind of gets rid of all of that in one fell swoop using nominalism as his sledgehammer. To be a bit technical, Maimonides' nominalism shifts the ontological register of these entities and the status of these beings to a per se rather than an in se condition. Thus, holiness, ritual purity, the special character of the Hebrew language or the people of Israel become contingent rather than metaphysically necessary or even as propria. They become conventions, not beings. This is a direct blow to the Neoplatonic philosophy of someone like Yehuda Halevi, but also to the metaphysics of the Sefer Yetzirah, which held that creation itself was begotten through the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, along with the first 10 numbers. A core concept to all later Jewish metaphysical speculation, and even the occult philosophy of people like Cornelius Agrippa and John Dee. If you've ever seen a magic circle or a symbol with Hebrew letters in it, it's downstream of the idea of the unique ontological character of the Hebrew language. Maimonides seems to reject this notion. Hebrew's just a language. It just so happens to be the language that God used to communicate the Bible in, but that's it. It's a convention. In fact, to the degree to which Maimonides did wish to shift the ontological nature of these concepts in Judaism is positively shocking. And it's no wonder that the reaction to his thought was as strident as it was. There's some book burning in the future. Sorry to tell you. Now, before proceeding, I just want to interject my own deep distaste for grouping all the things that I've just mentioned into a basket called proto-Kabbalah. I think that in Maimonides' Islamic context, these varied traditions from Merkavah Mysticism to the magical practices of late antiquity, which actually reach back to the late antique syncretism and the general contours of Neoplatonism, where all of this is just too nebulous to think of them as unified in any meaningful sense, much less as a proto-Kabbalah. It might just have been that Maimonides' systematic Aristotelianism was incommensurate with varied, in fact disconnected yet different forms of this so-called proto-Kabbalah for fundamentally different reasons. his systematic approach just captured them all rather than being one target of something that he was going against. That a critique captures various elements does not logically imply that these elements are part of a unified field. In fact, there's good reason to believe that they weren't. Now, I suspect that they were perhaps unified in Maimonides' mind as what we might call superstition or avodah zarah, but not under the rubric of proto-Kabbalah. Now, despite this concern on my part for the term proto-Kabbalah, which I do think does apply to very specific pre-Zohar theosophical speculation in southern France and Spain, a generation or so after the death of the Great Eagle, I do suspect Maimonides is wielding the guide as a weapon against the metaphysical and hermeneutical concerns discussed earlier. I do think he's going against them, I just don't think they're proto-Kabbalah. But does that make Maimonides an opponent of mysticism more generally? Well, that depends on what you mean by mysticism, but no, I actually don't think so. In fact, I suspect, and many others after him, that his conception of prophecy was downright mystical, though of a peculiar sort. Let's just turn to his idea of prophecy and mysticism just for a moment. Mysticism, to be honest, is just a fraught category, and there's no scholarly agreement about what it means or how it should be used. Period. The same can be said about magic, the occult, esotericism, etc. No one really has any agreement about what these terms mean. Two common and interlocking conceptions of mysticism have to do with union with the divine and the achievement of absolute knowing through some kind of non-rational or non-discursive means. It can also, of course, refer to the phenomenology of such an undertaking or the results of such an experience, which may or may not be propositional. It can also include the practices by which to induce such a phenomenological experience. See, it's just a giant mess of a concept. So, how might we hitch this horse to Maimonides just the same? Well, it has to do with his theory of prophecy, which I've actually covered in a bit deeper in my episode on Abulafia's ecstatic prophetic mysticism, which you can check out in the card above. Now, to get at this, we have to understand Aristotle's theory of motion, which is very peculiar and often misunderstood. For Aristotle, it's redundant and tautological, that might be redundant, to define motion as movement through space from position X to position Y, which incidentally is kind of the Galilean Newtonian definition. Galileo and Newton didn't care if it didn't make strict logical sense because it worked in the math. Philosophy be damned. For Aristotle and for Maimonides, motion is actually the metaphysical transition from a potential state latent in a substance to an actual state of that substance. Locomotion in terms of position in space is secondary to this deeper, more metaphysical change. Thus, everything that is, aside from the divine, begins in a potential state and must be actuated by an outside force. Again, this includes everything, including our minds, our souls, the knowing part of us. Now, for minds in general to be activated, there must be a pre-existent mind, that is to say, the always active divine mind that does the work of activating our minds. The passive mind has to be activated by an active mind. And what is probably the most tortured paragraph in all of Aristotle, he describes this separate active divine mind which activates the potential states of all minds, including yours and mine. And this is what gets us to Maimonides and his theory of prophecy. According to Maimonides, if a mind is particularly righteous, rational, and imaginative, then it can be activated through communion with the active intellect, the divine mind itself, which is not bound by, petty things like temporality. Thus, the divine mind experiences time just like we experience physical distance. You can be closer or further from me in space, but we exist at the same time. Kind of. For the divine mind, all physical and temporal events are equal distant from it. Thus the famous medieval dictum that God is an infinite circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. It's like the Western equivalent of like a Zen koan or something. In this communion with the divine mind, perhaps the closest Judaism comes to union with the divine in any real strict sense, Maimonides provides for the possibility of prophetic clarity through contact with the hyper-rational divine mind of the active intelligence. It's then perhaps unsurprising that as Abraham Abulafia was developing his ecstatic prophetic form of Kabbalah, he would lean heavily, very heavily, on Maimonides' theory of prophecy, in which the development of the techniques by which one could transform oneself into a prophet. Maimonides theorizes what a prophet is. Abulafia develops the mystical techniques to transform oneself into one. And no, those works are not translated into English. Sorry. Lastly, while one can credit or blame Maimonides with the depopulation of the heavens, as we noted earlier, his universe is certainly not the dead mechanistic universe of, say, 17th century French rationalism. Rather, he inherits the Neoplatonized Aristotelian cosmos in which there reaches a metaphysical chain down from the prime divine mover of pure active intellect down through the spheres of angelic separate intelligences to the informed matter of our realm. These intermediate beings between the divine and ourselves are also purely formal beings marked by their separate intelligences whose task it is to communicate final causation to the spheres below. Their association with the planets whose very movement was indicative of their intelligence sees them as reaching in staged succession up through the sublunar realm of rectilinear movement, generation, and destruction to the increasingly perfect and thus changeless realm of eternal circular movement, whose apex is the pure active intellect of the divine, the ultimate divine source of all being, but also the final design to which all beings strive. By no means is the cosmos of Maimonides an inert universe of blind causation, atoms and void, but a balance of form and matter set into beautiful harmony, all conducted under the guidance of a loving and wise guidance of the divine. Thus, as our senses and our intellect gaze up to contemplate the vastness of the spheres of the cosmos, this too is a kind of communion with the divine intellect having activated our own human and divine intellect calling to each other through the crystalline spheres of the heavens. A love informed by all seeking and wonder, whose echo would reach through the centuries to Spinoza's concept of the intellectual love of the divine. It's a positively harmonious, beautiful image of human intellect and divine intellect reaching for each other through the spheres of the heavens. Maimonides was neither the first Jewish Aristotelian rationalist, Ibn Daud might rightly take that title, nor the most radical, I would say. I think Gersonides would probably take the cake there, so much so that his work, Milchamot Hashem, The Wars of the Lord, was mocked by his contemporaries as Milchamot al Hashem, the wars upon the Lord. I love medieval shade. I love medieval shade. But this unique position in the Jewish world, the clarity of his exposition and the specific time at which he wrote would go on to light a conflagration within the Jewish world with the Maimonidean controversy rendering communities asunder. It just tore communities apart. For some, his work represented the definitive synthesis of Judaism and philosophy. For others, it was just atheism in the garb of Judaism. His works would be heralded by some and burned in the gutter by others. And it was in that crucible, at least in part, that one anti-Maimonidean would forever transform Judaism. Having had a copy of the Guide to the Perplexed copied for him in 1264, the Castilian Rabbi Moshe de Leon and his circle would begin formulating a vision of Judaism where the heavens were repopulated with hosts of angels and demons. The body of the divine was composed of discrete emanations of the divine, the famous Sphirot, where metaphor and ontology weave seamlessly together, and where the most Baroque metaphysical realism imaginable would thunder away the Spartan nominalism of the great eagle. Out of the crucible of the Maimonidean reaction would come the Book of Radiance, the Sefer HaZohar, the foundational text of the Kabbalah, thus setting Judaism on a course that, if the Rambam could have imagined it, which I don't think he could have, would have likely filled him with as much dread as awe. Like every genius, Maimonides, the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, HaNesher HaGadol, the great eagle was many people at once. Thus, we shouldn't be surprised that his relationship to such a complex concept like mysticism, forgiving the anachronism of using that term, would itself be deeply complex. As we've seen, he stood at a crossroads in Jewish history, seeming to struggle intellectually and philosophically against what he took to be a very un-Jewish anthropomorphic theory of mysticism flourishing in the Merkavah Mysticism and the ontological promiscuity of the metaphysical realism of his time, that of the Platonists like Yehuda Halevi, or the Sefer Yetzirah with its ontology of the Hebrew language. But his rationalism, as much as it can be called that, was by no means the mechanical materialism of the Enlightenment. Further, the very reaction against him seems to have propelled the Kabbalah itself into being. In fact, his positions on the cosmos and prophecy set the stage for the rise of the prophetic Kabbalah in the form of Abraham Abulafia, and the view that the great eagle himself was a Kabbalist, as evidenced by numerous Jewish luminaries and non-Jewish luminaries like Pico. While there's no real evidence of his late conversion to Kabbalah, the complexity of his genius makes his thought perennially compelling. A rationalist dedicated to clarity, an esoteric writer hiding his positions, an intellectual mystic, a legalist, a rabbi, maybe even a thinly veiled atheist of a sort, a pious Jew championing the pagan Aristotle. All of these things and much more beyond, in fact. Maimonides' genius rests forever beyond either rationalism or mysticism. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.